This carved wall inside the Temple of Seti I is the Abydos King List. It serves as a sacred, official roster of Egyptian royalty, used to legitimize the current ruling dynasty by linking them directly to their predecessors. In Egyptian theology, a person achieves eternal life only as long as their name is spoken. By carving these royal cartouches into stone, the reigning king created an active spiritual engine that kept his ancestors alive forever. But if you follow the chronological sequence through the 18th dynasty, you hit a glaring anomaly. The lineage skips directly from Amenhotep III to a general named Horemheb. Nearly 20 years of history have been bypassed. That gap is an intentional, state-sponsored erasure. The government sought to obliterate an entire generation of pharaohs from existence. The Romans later called this practice damnatio memoriae, the condemnation of memory. Because an Egyptian's afterlife depended on their names surviving in the physical world, smashing a name out of the stone was a punishment far worse than death. It meant permanent deletion from eternity. What crime was severe enough to warrant the systemic execution of 4 successive rulers? To find out, we must piece together the fragmented, contradictory texts those deleted kings left behind. The trouble began when a young pharaoh named Amenhotep IV changed his name to Akhenaten and launched a transformation of the Egyptian state. He moved to shutter Egypt's ancient temples and began dispatching agents to physically chisel the name of the state god, Amun, off existing monuments. He even abandoned the seat of power at Thebes. He ordered the construction of a brand new, isolated city in the desert, a site now called Amarna, dedicated entirely to his preferred deity, the Aten. The royal art style warped as well. The godlike, athletic proportions of previous pharaohs were replaced by androgynous, exaggerated features, slender necks, heavy thighs, and prominent, sagging bellies. These shifts in theology and art reached beyond the temple walls. They signaled a deliberate break with the systems that had held the Egyptian state together for centuries. We can see the intent behind this new regime in its foundational manifesto, a poem known as the Great Hymn to the Aten. This stela shows the specific theological claim found within that hymn. It asserts that Akhenaten is the only earthly entity who understands the Aten and the sole mediator for the god's power. You can see the sun rays ending in tiny hands, offering the Ankh, the symbol of life, directly to the king, bypassing the priesthoods that had traditionally managed the nation's spiritual life. This effectively stripped those institutions of their massive wealth, land, and political influence. The Great Hymn reveals that Atomism was, in practice, a mechanism for absolute, centralized authoritarian control. Akhenaten's reign ended after 17 years, leaving the borders in neglect and the military struggling to hold territory in the north. The counter-revolution was eventually spearheaded by his young successor, a boy king named Tutankhamun. To stabilize the country, Tutankhamun's administration issued a legal decree known as the Restoration Stela. It explicitly brands the Amarna period as a failure, claiming the world was in chaos and the gods had turned their backs. Tutankhamun issued physical mandates for the recovery of the state, reopening the temples, reinstating the priests, and heavily funding the reconstruction of monuments to Amun. The Restoration Stela functions as ideological damage control, a legal framework designed to anchor the new regime's authority by explicitly condemning the previous one. Since Tutankhamun spent his reign restoring the traditional religion and order, you would expect to see him celebrated on the Abydos King List. But if we return to the wall, Tutankhamun is absent. The redaction takes out Akhenaten, his brief successor Smenkhkare, Tutankhamun, and his advisor Ai. Pharaoh Horemheb decided that regardless of Tutankhamun's restorative actions, the boy king was too closely tied to the heretic bloodline to be saved. He used the Abydos wall to bridge the gap, connecting his own reign directly to the era before the heresy began. These lists were never intended to be objective history. They were carefully engineered political propaganda, designed to manufacture a perfect, unbroken lineage. To finalize the deletion, subsequent pharaohs physically dismantled Akhenaten's isolated desert city, but as they tore down his monuments, they dropped the stones into the sand. The desert climate quickly buried those carved blocks, locking them in a dark, dry environment for over 3,000 years. The state launched a systematic campaign to obliterate Akhenaten's memory from the earth. And by burying his city in the desert, that exact campaign is what preserved his story.